Up Tuesday, everyone. Got our presentations today. And before I introduce our esteemed speaker, I have a couple of announcements are predictably relating to Thursday since the deliverable three is due on Thursday. So first and foremost on deliverable number three, we are going to meet in class on Thursday. We're going to have our review of Madoff securities. We're going to have our final quiz. Then whatever time is remaining in class, you can use to prepare for your deliverable three. I have pushed the deliverable three to be due at the end of day Thursday instead of at the beginning of class. So you do have a little bit of extra time if you need it. I would encourage you not to wait and to not wait to do it until Thursday to make sure that you've done some work up until that point. But if you need some polishing, then you can do that. Regarding the deliverable, there's been a few questions I wanted to address. For the most part, your deliverable is going to be the results of your investigation into the other student's fraud case. You may choose to include some information about the information you provided to your investigator, just for context and clarity. I will be grading on both criteria, both on how you conducted your investigation and how you responded to your investigator. So if you decide not to provide any information, it's all on the person who's investigating your case on how you did. And if they decide to stab you in the back, well, so be it. I don't think anybody in this room would consciously do that, but I just wanted to let you know that you may want to provide some clarity on the work that you did for your investigation. And then on that note, please make sure that you're being diligent in responsiveness to your investigators. I've had not a lot, but a few people who told me that they're having trouble getting their investigations off the ground because the people whose case they belong to are not responding in a timely manner. Please note that I am being very aware of that, and that will affect your grade. So if you've done that, don't do it anymore. Make sure that you're responding in a timely manner and getting those investigations done. Also, as a reminder, we are not meeting for class on Tuesday next week, but we are starting our final case presentations on Thursday and to be extended into finals week. So please make sure you have that on your roster. All right, so with that, I do want to tell you a little bit about what we're going to be doing today. So we're going to, I think for the time perspective, since these are 15-minute presentations, we're going to go through the presentations. Then at the end of the presentations, I'm going to let our esteemed visitor, our esteemed guest here, ask some questions or provide some insight on the cases as a whole, and ask any questions of the groups that have that, just to make sure that we have time to get through the presentations. But this gentleman who's here, this is Ken Zico. Technically speaking, his name is Kenneth Zico Esquire, CHC. I don't even know what the CHC stands for, but has something to do with compliance, right?
Certified in healthcare compliance.
Certified in healthcare compliance. All right. So he's been providing healthcare litigation compliance services for over 30 years. After receiving his Juris Doctorate from the University of Oklahoma's College of Law, he went to work in attorney service positions at the U.S. Social Security Administration, Parkland Hospital, KPMG, Crow, and Hall Render. And though he retired in 2004, he still contracts for compliance advisory or service work on a regular basis. From a personal perspective, you notice the word KPMG snuck its way into there. Ken was actually my mentor at KPMG. He provided me with invaluable insight for my career path. I don't think I would legitimately be where I am today without his help. And on a small note, he actually saved me from getting fired my first year. So if you're thankful for me being here today, you can thank Ken for that because he indirectly contributed to that. If you're not thankful for me being here, you can blame Ken for that. So yeah, that's
How long were you at KPMG?
5 years.
Oh, so technically I stopped you from getting fired for your first, second, third, fourth, and 5 years. But hey.
Pretty much,
Yeah.
pretty much par for the course. Yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, as you can tell, Ken and I have a very good natured relationship, but he's a very, very knowledgeable man. It's been my true honor to actually have been able to work with him and then to be able to call on him for advice and for information. I think he'll have some meaningful input and to provide, but I'm going to go ahead and just let him say hello and tell you a little bit about himself.
Thanks, Michael. I appreciate it. And yeah, I am equally honored. Um, I tell people fairly frequently I was blessed to work with some incredible folks. And when I talk about the best folks that I was blessed to work with, there's a woman I worked with at Navigant that I tell everybody she was kind of the epitome of a consultant. And then I tell them someone named Michael Barnes. So he knocked it out of the park, and I actually was his boss. And that's kind of old school back in the day. They used to, at the Big Four, they used to have someone be your boss that was actually working with you. Now, a lot of them have gone to a model where you have somebody that's kind of like a manager or a director that manages or is the boss of multiple people, like 10 people. They tend not to be somebody that's in the on the front lines as much, but back in the day, it was awesome working with Michael. Yeah, like Michael said, I started out as a lawyer, then went into consulting. One of the things I want to be able to do is kind of give you all an insight as to how things tend to really, really work at these consulting firms, accounting firms. And basically, that's it. I will say for whoever's speaking on Forest Park Medical Center, um, my kids are now 27 and 22, almost 23. And when we used to drive by there on a regular basis to go up to Chinatown in Dallas, north of Dallas, and whenever we did for literally 5 years, I would sing, "Someone's going to jail, someone's committing healthcare fraud," because you, when somebody's doing when it looks too good to be true, often it is too good to be true. So that's the one thing that I'll say to you all when we get started is trust your gut. If you see something, that old British saying, if you see something, say something. Typically, what I found throughout my whole career is if you get a sense for the culture of an organization, and usually it's the CEO, CFO that tend to, and COO and general counsel that tend to push that culture or create that culture. There's a reason why that old adage, where there's smoke, there's fire, exists. And in my career, working in almost all of the big cases in healthcare, usually it started at the top. So I'll turn it over to you, Michael.
All right. So I think we'll go ahead and kick things off with a bang. We'll start with Forest Park Medical Center since it's our first group. Give me a second to get things set up here, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, Forest Park, you're up. Oh, we need Alex's section too, don't we?
We have a link on there. So
Okay,
it shows
sure.
there. Okay, so for our fraud case, we did Forest Park Medical Center. I'm Isaac. Alex will be on video here shortly.
My name is Ben.
My name's Meg.
So kind of going into the background of Forest Park, it was founded in 2009 and it's in the Texas area, specifically their main centers in Dallas. And they also have locations in Frisco, Southlake, Fort Worth, and San Antonio. And they were known as your premium alternative to your traditional hospitals. They were kind of doing specific jobs, and they relied heavily on physician relationships, knowing that their surgeons and their doctors are the people bringing in the patients. So they made sure that they had those people on deck quickly. Then going into the business model overview, they were, like I said, they focused on that luxury hotel-like experience. A lot of the patients would describe it like a spa or a getaway. They really wanted to be at that high end for the medical area. And they were a physician-owned hospital system. And this is that a lot of the doctors and surgeons had some stake in the company, which can kind of be seen as a red flag early, but they're also staff there. And then another reason why being a physician-owned hospital system is very beneficial is you kind of get to choose what areas you specify in. And so they're in orthopedic, spine, and bariatric surgeries. And bariatric surgeries are helping with over obese people and kind of the surgeries that just help you lose fat quickly. And then they also did out of network billing, which Alex will get into later, but this helped them be more flexible in being able to bill their patients at a lower price, but then getting the insurance companies at a higher price. And then kind of go into the rapid growth of how they grew so quickly. And the first thing is a high margin specialization, and being owned by physician owned. They didn't have to worry about a lot of the low profit services that a lot of the medical centers use, like an ER or a psychiatric ward. They focus on those high margin, high profit areas. And with specialization, having the surgeons for those specific areas allowed for higher turnarounds in their operating rooms. I think they said that per day they're going like 4 to 5 patients per room compared to like 1 to 2 in your normal hospital. And then an advantage of being physician owner is, since they had stake in the company, a lot of their surgeons knew that if they were bringing their patients to Forest Park, that they'd be making more money quickly, since the patient's going to be choosing the surgeon and not the location. And then patient profile, Alex is going to get into this, but they focus on a lot of the higher end customers that had high reimbursing private insurance. And this kind of goes along with the out of network billing, as it will bring in more money and they're able to get the insurance companies more.
Hello everyone, I'm filming this video because I will not be in class on Tuesday. I should be in an MRI by the time this video is being played, but more importantly, the Forest Park Medical Center fraud. So I'll be going over the fraud scheme overview. Starting off with the several risks that are common in the healthcare industry. Hospitals rely heavily on physician referrals, which creates an opportunity for abuse in those relationships, and if they're not properly monitored. In addition, healthcare billing is extremely complex, and out-of-network pricing gives providers flexibility in how much they charge, making it easier to manipulate revenue. And so in this specific case, the fraud scheme involved illegal kickbacks being paid to physicians in exchange for referring patients to the hospital. These payments were disguised as consulting fees and marketing agreements, but they were actually tied to the number of surgeries performed and the value of the procedures. This created a strong financial incentive for the physicians to send more patients to the hospital. And from a fraud perspective, that was a clear pressure to generate higher revenue, especially by targeting high-paying procedures. And then moving on to how the fraud works. This scheme works by targeting high-paying patients, particularly those with out-of-network insurance plans. These patients generated the significantly higher reimbursements, making them more valuable to the hospital. And then to attract them, the hospital promised in-network pricing, making it seem like the patients would not face out-of-pocket costs, which in return was not true. And then, however, behind the scenes, the hospital was overbilling insurance companies at out-of-network rates. And after receiving the payments from insurers, they would write off the remaining balance as bad debt. This made it appear as though the hospital was absorbing the costs, when in reality, it was part of this scheme to conceal the true pricing structure. And then, as you can see here in the graphic on the right-hand side, I kind of laid it out, all the different parts of the fraud. First, the doctors referring and promising these prices that they weren't able to fulfill, and then the patients expecting lower costs, being overbilled, and then writing off as bad debt, all being concealed in the financial records. And then lastly, the major risks inside of this. There are several major red flags in this case that would stand out to an auditor or investigator. First, the revenue appears to be driven by physician referrals rather than an actual patient demand. This suggests that the financial incentives are influencing behavior. So we all know that this is a clear pressure inside the fraud triangle, as we've learned. And then second, the physician compensation structures are highly irregular. Payments were made under vague or consulting or marketing agreements, but there's little evidence that legitimate services were actually provided. And then another major red flag is the presence of large bad debt write-offs. Despite high reported revenue, significant accounts were written off, which can indicate the hospital was overbilling and then using accounting adjustments to hide it. And then finally, there was a lack of independent oversight, being there were weak internal controls and limited review of physician relationships and billing practices. So kind of the tone at the top that we've been talking about in class. And that's it for me. Thank you.
So for the financial impact, it was around a $200 million scheme. And then roughly 40 million of that was disguised as consulting and marketing fees. The way they were able to achieve this was they had these shell companies run by Jackson Jacob. And so instead of like paying it to the medical center, you would pay it to the shell company, and that shell company would then pay it out to the physicians. And these physicians would receive anywhere from 100,000 to 7 million. And besides just Forest Park having this big financial impact, a lot of insurance companies were affected, especially government plans. And so like overall they were billed over 500 million, but 200 million of that was actually collected over a 4-year span. So some of the government plans was TRICARE, which was 25 million, and then the US Department of Defense's healthcare, which was over 10. And then the largest we found was the Federal and Retirees Healthcare Program, which was over 60 million. And then a couple other insurance plans that you might recognize was United Healthcare, Cigna, and then Aetna. So the legal consequences. So there were 14 defendants that were actually convicted. 12 of them are currently serving or did serve federal prison time. The 2 defendants that did not, they got put on probation. They were found guilty of misprison, which basically means they knew a fraud was happening and they decided not to report on it. So they only got 3 years and 5 years probation. But the people that ended up in prison, they were sentenced to a combined 74 years in order to pay almost 83 million in restitution. But the government also plans to collect more than 25 million in money judgments. So these were the main players of the fraud that we looked at. So Wilton McBurt, he was actually the managing partner. He received the highest prison sentence of, I think it's around like 12.5 years is what it converts to. He was found guilty on 10 out of 12 counts, which is like conspiracy, paying kickbacks, commercial bribery, money laundering, which you'll see that's kind of a pattern, especially with paying kickbacks in the commercial bribery. And Jackson Jacob, he was the owner of the shell company. He was the next highest prison sentence with 96 months. And then Alec Bucamp, he was the hospital manager. I'm pretty sure he was actually the first person to step forward and like plead guilty that there was fraud happening. So he was sentenced to 63 months. And then Dr. Barker was a co-founder of Forest Park, and he was sentenced to 60 months.
Okay, so I'm going to be going into the key fraud risk factors. So starting with pressure, Forest Park Medical Center had a competitive healthcare market. They were competing with other high-end hospitals for patients for that revenue. The surgeries cost a lot of money, so having to charge them a good amount of money for profitability was big pressure that they had. And then opportunity. So physician ownership equals more control. Since this was a physician-owned company, they kind of had a say in everything that was happening, the referrals they were giving, the patients that they were bringing in. And that goes hand in hand with the weak oversight. If you have all that control and no oversight, you have the good opportunity to commit fraud. And then like we've touched on earlier, the complex billing systems, those out of network billing systems and structures are a good opportunity since they're very complex to hide things, to misrepresent. And then going into rationalization, we think a good way that they were rationalizing this was the everyone benefits mindset. And that is shown through like the physicians are making more money, the hospital is making good money, the patients are still getting the care, so everyone is benefiting. And so that leads into the justifying unethical behavior as normal. That just kind of became the acceptable norm of the hospital. And then some lessons learned that we've touched on. So ethical physician relationships are critical since physicians were getting paid to refer patients. That's a big conflict of interest. And it shows that physicians were probably sometimes more focused on money than diagnosing these patients. And then out of network billing can be abused since they, as we touched on earlier, they would tell the patients they would charge them less, but they're actually making these rates higher. So they were misleading and being very unfair to the patients they had. And the strong internal controls are necessary. As we all know, strong internal controls are kind of the backbone of auditing. We need those to either prevent the fraud from occurring in general or to detect this fraud earlier on. And then transparency in financial billings. So this one is also something we can learn from because they were disguising their payments and stuff as like consulting fees, marketing fees. So looking out for that as auditors is something that we can do. And then fraud can occur even in high-end organizations. So Forest Park Medical Center was, they prided themselves in being very luxurious. People trusted them. So making sure that as auditors we practice due diligence and professional skepticism is something we can do to prevent fraud. That's all we have. Thank you.
So I guess my main question is, what did they do that was wrong? Like you guys talked about conflict of interest, but why can't the physicians receive payments for sending patients to the organization? Like what did they do that was wrong? What law did they break? It doesn't sound like they broke any laws.
Sorry, I kind of interrupted. Can you repeat your question, Ken?
I was going to say, what did they do that was wrong? I heard that there was a conflict of interest, but I don't know that a conflict of interest is breaking a law. So what's the number one thing they did that was illegal, supposedly?
I would say that the number one thing is probably the kickbacks that they were paying to their like surgeons and doctors to get patients into Forest Park Medical Center is probably the number one thing I'd say.
Yeah. So is that illegal to accept kickbacks?
Yes, it's illegal. There was a recent like act that was passed where I think Forest Park was the first case that like they used this law like to basically sentence all these people, but I don't remember the name of it.
Okay. Yeah, like in general, your bosses probably would want to know, hey, what law did they break? We understand that it's a conflict of interest, and these were smart physicians, smart business people. They thought they thought they had found a way to skin the cat without causing them personal risk of going to jail. And the main thing was they thought they weren't accepting federal dollars. So if you don't accept federal dollars, their contention was they can't be held responsible for violating the anti-kickback statute, which is a federal law. So the law that they did try to get them with was called the Travel Act. And that basically is a federal law that says if you do anything illegal at the state level, will allow you, and you do it for the purposes of breaking some sort of state law, then will allow you to get federal jurisdiction. So to what extent the government even had jurisdiction over them to find them guilty of all these things and take these settlements, that's the main issue that was kind of brewing in Forest Park Medical Center.
Good information. Thank you, guys. And we're going to move on to Tenet.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Mary.
I'm Joe.
I'm McKenna.
I'm Jack.
And today we were presenting on Tenet Healthcare. An overview of the company. Tenet was formed in Dallas, Texas in 1969. At that point, it was known as National Medical Enterprises, or NME for short, and it rebranded to Tenet when it acquired American Medical Holdings to increase its presence to a couple other states. It has over 65 hospitals and 450 healthcare facilities, and the 4 states it operates primarily in are Texas, California, Florida, and Michigan. It employs over 100,000 employees in the US, and it has 4 primary operating segments. The first is USPI. This is another business they partner with, and through this partnership, they have the largest ambulatory program in the nation. Their hospitals are their primary segment. They have everything from specialty hospitals to specialty care clinics, diagnostic imaging centers, and emergency departments. Conifer Health Solutions is their healthcare revenue management program where they work with over 660 clients advising them. And then lastly, Global Business Center is their shared services provider where they primarily oversee their administrative and corporate responsibilities. The business has been under very close scrutiny for various business practices throughout its life, as we'll soon see. The 3 fraud cases that we are looking specifically into today occurred in 2006, 2013, and 2014. The first fraud that we're looking into in 2006 was for unlawful Medicare billing practices. This was where Tenet hospitals were paying physicians to refer their patients to Tenet facilities, even though this was not in the best interest of the client. The violation of law here was several areas, the first being the anti-kickback statute, or AKS, which prohibits paying to induce referrals of patients to areas with federal healthcare programs in place, which is what Tenet has. Additionally, Stark Law was violated. This goes really hand in hand with AKS because it prohibits physicians from referring patients somewhere they have a financial interest in, which in this case were those kickbacks they were receiving from Tenet. And then they were also abusing outlier payments. These are extraordinarily high costs of care for certain procedures, and they were assigning this to different patients that did not have the procedures done. And then they were also upcoding, which is giving improper diagnosis codes to patients. All of this to just increase the cost and increase the reimbursement. Eventually, whistleblowers came forth and the extent of the fraud was found, and the resolution was that they had to pay $725 million over the course of 4 years and then forego another $175 million in future healthcare payments. And then from the result of this fraud, they also had to close 10 of their facilities.
Yeah, so unfortunately, the fraud did not stop there, even despite the high restitution payout. So this second fraud actually started in about 2000, and took place over about a decade and a half to 2013, 2014, when it was ultimately uncovered. Essentially, what was happening here is 2 Tenet subsidiaries in the Atlanta, Georgia area were providing bribes and kickbacks to a prenatal clinic in the area. the prenatal clinic in response would tell their primarily low income patients that they had to visit a tenant hospital in order to receive financial aid through Medicare and Medicaid. Unfortunately, the prenatal clinic served mostly Hispanic undocumented immigrants. So there were people that didn't really have that basis of knowledge of healthcare in the US. Easy to lie to about that scenario. And there could have even been a language barrier that added to the complication and really targeting a vulnerable group of people. So they violated the anti-kickback statute through these bribes and kickbacks, and ultimately put the lives of people, women and their babies at risk. A lot of times women were having to travel farther distances to reach a tenant hospital. So like women going into labor because it's a prenatal clinic. The safest option is to visit the closest hospital, but because they were told that they had to go to a tenant one to receive the financial aid, they would have to travel farther distances during that time. Ultimately, what was happening is they were increased their low-income patients at these hospitals due to these referrals, and then they would receive larger reimbursements of Medicare and Medicaid from both federal government and from Georgia government. Financial impact, at least at the federal level, was about $145 million in corruptly acquired medical payments. And they ultimately settled for about $513 million, pleading guilty. And most of those payments actually went to the federal government for defrauding the US and then state Georgia governments as well. And then finally, the last fraud we're covering today occurred in 2014 to 2017. This is very, very similar to what the fraud Mary talked about earlier, whereas physicians at non-tenant hospitals like outpatient centers or local offices were getting kickbacks in order to refer their patients to tenant hospitals, specifically to Detroit Medical Center in Michigan. And there were about 13 physicians involved in this whole process. Again, they violated the anti-kickback statute and were falsely acquiring Medicare payments through this means. And this was a civil lawsuit that was settled for $30 million. Some of it going to the whistleblowers, others going to the federal government.
I want to be talking about what makes the healthcare industry so susceptible to fraud. Now, tenant also took advantage of that. So first of all, economic incentives, pretty much all fraud that is done, no matter what the industry is, it's going to be for a financial benefit. That's emphasized a little more in the healthcare industry, just because the vast amount of money that's involved in an industry, especially when you look at things such as Medicare and Medicaid, and then also the healthcare industry is based off a fee-for-service model. So there's incentive for hospitals to, one, provide more services, and two, provide more complex services that are more expensive. For information asymmetry, that's referring to the knowledge gap, something I think that we can all think of as the knowledge gap between a doctor and a client, especially knowledge on how the healthcare industry works when it comes to things such as surgeries, billing, diagnoses, things like that. And then another knowledge gap between tenants specifically, was between them and the federal government, what the federal government, how they thought they were operating versus how tenant was actually operating. And then for agency conflict, that's referring to the principal agent problem. There's numerous combinations of this in the healthcare industry, but when I talk about tenants specifically, I'll mention the key one. Moving on to tenants specifically for the economic incentives, what Mary talked about earlier with the outlier payments and the upcoding, they found an easy way to manipulate the Medicare system to receive more payments than they should. So the cost to charge ratio, that has to do with the outlier payments. They made their charges a lot higher, which reduced that ratio, and then the reduced ratio leads to higher payments. And then for the diagnosis related group classification, that's the upcoding. That was where, patients may come in with a common cold or something like that, and then be diagnosed with pneumonia. So their code number is different, and that fluctuates the fixed fee that they were paid out. For information asymmetry, like I was talking about, with how the government thought they were operating versus how they were actually operating. The government really didn't have much oversight on, the patients that were coming in to those hospitals, which is what made it very easy for Tenet to, falsely diagnose them, upcode them, and increase their costs. And then for the prenatal clinics, that's more of the doctor to patient knowledge gap. I kind of talked about earlier. A lot of these patients, they were low income, did not have very good understanding. And then also them being low income, their main focus concern was getting their costs covered. Tenet was easily able to, while the clinics that they were at, the Tenet was paying, were easily able to convince them they needed to go to a Tenet hospital because all they cared about was getting their costs covered. And then for the agency conflict, this applies to all three frauds: patient, physician. I think we can all agree when we go into the doctor's office, we think that the doctor is acting in our best interest with what they diagnose us and how they want to help us. And the first one where they were, I had mentioned earlier, kind of an uncommon cold, getting told we have pneumonia, that's violating that, and that's due to the financial benefits that they were receiving. As soon as those start coming in, that relationship is altered. And then for the prenatal clinics, I'm not going to talk about too much, but how, those people came in, they needed help, and they didn't get the best help that they got, and they had to drive those long distances as well. And then for the third fraud, where there were physicians that were referring patients to Tenet hospitals, some of those people could have came in with very serious health issues. They could have received much better care in a more specialized hospital, but instead they were sent to Tenet hospitals just because of the financial benefits.
I had to. So kind of preventing fraud in the healthcare industry in a whole, I focused on like the executives' liabilities, the automatic billing flags you could put in place, in real-time billing audits, and kind of the doctor's compensation structure. For executive liabilities, we believe they should be more personally liable for these frauds taking place. In general, if they're not involved, which most of the time they are, they should be still held liable and still know your controls are in place and your systems are working correctly. So these things cannot happen. Automatic billing flags and real-time billing audits kind of go right hand in hand. So in the 2006 fraud, you'd be able to detect the outlier payments a lot quicker. So you're able to stop the fraud when it occurs and limit the damage there. And the real-time audits, obviously both these things are very costly to implement in the healthcare industry or any industry. They would still help prevent fraud in multiple different scenarios as you're constantly looking at their financials and all their systems. And it kind of scares the employees more or less of they're always being watched, and you can't make up for it at the end of the year when the audit is coming in. And then their compensation structure, kind of these kickbacks and referrals they were getting, we're trying to switch that more to just patient care in general, and not how many patients you serve or how many tests you do, just kind of limiting the cost for the patient in general and the opportunity for these doctors to do so. So overall, Tenet was obviously failed by ethical culture because they seem to not really care that fraud is taking place. They kind of just kept on repeating the same patterns or a version of them. It wasn't just one rogue employee like, oh, we don't really care. It was kind of just, you could tell the executives didn't really care about what was going on. I found out they signed a corporate integrity agreement at the first hearing at least, and it kind of just said, sorry, we'll do better next time. This won't happen again. And obviously it happened twice after that. So like you can tell these agreements and these fines they have to pay aren't really showing any behavioral change, and you kind of do more personal liability changes. So overall, the incentives from the doctors to get extra compensation by these kickback schemes and the weak oversight by the executives kind of led to this fraudulent transactions. And it's more about the leadership of the company, the accountability, and the systems in place, not the regulations by the industry. That's all we had.
Do you all know, did Tenet actually go to trial with any of these schemes?
Repeat your question, guys.
Do you all know, did Tenet go to trial, and were they found guilty in the criminal proceedings, or did they settle? How did this go about?
They settled.
In
The second fraud that I discussed, they pled guilty and were ordered to pay restitution. In the third one I talked about, it was a civil suit because it was a whistleblower case under the False Claims Act. So they settled on that case.
The first one they settled as well.
Yeah. Do you know if the leadership, like for example, the CEO, did the CEO have to step down, or did the CEO maintain his role throughout all of these?
I'm not sure off the top of my head. I know that the CEO at the time for the second fraud case we discussed, they actually dropped a case against him for that fraud, about a year ago. So he was never actually charged for the crime. I don't know if, I imagine he had to step down, but.
Yeah. That's awesome. I mean, I think you all did a great job of mentioning the actual laws that were allegedly broken. Um, I always say it's all fun and games until someone gets poked in the eye with a stick. And Michael and I were at KPMG when the first um, incident happened, and KPMG was Tenet's external auditor, and KPMG had been Tenet's external auditor for like 30 years. And that outlier payment issue, Tenet thought that Tenet tried to say that their external auditor, KPMG, should have seen that outlier issue, should have seen that Tenet was making gobs of money compared to their competitors, and should have said something. So that became pretty contentious pretty fast. And they put their bid up for external audit the very next year, and KPMG did not win that bid. And that was like a, I don't know, $6 million client or something like that.
So our organization was HCA Healthcare, and we're gonna talk about the fraud that they committed today. I'm Austin.
I'm Jared. I'm Troy.
And I'm Tyler Woods.
So a little overview of what we're gonna be talking about today, the company background, their business model, the fraudulent activities that occurred, and then the consequences and takeaways. So starting off with the background of the company. So HCA stands for Hospital Corporations of America, and they've had a couple different names over the years. And they focus on comprehensive medical services. So this includes specialized emergency and urgency care, outpatient and home health, and just general support services. They're located in more than 190 hospitals with 2,500 care sites in 20 different states and the UK. And they were founded in Nashville in 1968 by Dr. Thomas First Sr. and his son, Dr. Thomas First Jr., and then Jack Massey. And their mission statement is, above all else, we are committed to the care and improvement of human life. And there was a number of frauds that occurred here. So this included illegal accounting practices and things like inflating Medicare and Medicaid billing, upcoding diagnosis, increased medical reimbursement rates, billing for unnecessary or unperformed lab tests, and physician kickbacks and incentives. And there was many different whistleblowers, but the main one was James Alderson, who was a hospital CFO in Montana, who was fired for refusing to file false cost reports. And then another significant whistleblower was John Schilling, who was a reimbursement manager in Florida, who was actually cooperating with the FBI in order to uncover the billing fraud.
So now I'll be covering their business model. So HCA is a for-profit company. They are listed on the Fortune 500 as number 61, actually. So they are one of the largest companies by revenue in the US. And they expand through seeking higher levels of vertical and horizontal integration. Now, the ways that they achieve vertical integration is by controlling all aspects of the healthcare process. They have outpatient care facilities for the initial clinics that people go to get diagnosed. They control the larger hospitals where they get more intensive care surgery centers. And then they follow up other outpatient care centers where people would go to get follow-up services. And to achieve horizontal integration, they rapidly expanded through mergers and acquisitions. And they leveraged this massive size, as Austin said, they have 190 hospitals, 2,500 sites of care, and they also admit 2 million patients annually. They leverage this massive size to create an economy of scale in order to reduce their cost per patient and try and deliver the best value that they can. Now, since a lot of this fraud comprises Medicare and Medicaid, I thought it was important to mention that Medicare and Medicaid actually comprise 44.51% of their revenue as of 2024. So a lot of their money comes from those services.
All right, and now we're going to break down each of the fraudulent activities individually, starting with their inflated Medicare billing. So to start, I want to give you guys kind of just like a high-level overview of how this system works. So Medicare actually makes interim payments to the hospital, which acts as advances, and these are based on projected costs for the hospital for the year. And then at the end of the year, the hospital is required to submit an annual cost report. So this is the annual actual expenses, which is then submitted to Medicare. And then there's a settlement and potential reimbursements. So Medicare will review it and determine if they paid them too much or too little. In this case, since HCA was inflating expenses, Medicare would reimburse because they thought they weren't paying them enough. The way that HCA pulled this off is they actually had two sets of books internally. One was their legitimate internal cost report. So this consisted of the costs that were actually eligible expenses to be reimbursed by Medicare, such as physician salaries, medical equipment, and things like that, as well as the real percentage of Medicare patients. So another way that those projected costs are calculated is by determining like what percentage of the patients you see are actually Medicare eligible. And then a second cost report, which is what they used to actually submit to Medicare, was it included all of the legitimate expenses, but also they threw in some things that shouldn't have been in there, such as marketing expenses or executive salaries. Obviously, these are not medically relevant, so they were not eligible to be reimbursed. And they also kind of inflated the percentage of Medicare patients. So like, for example, if a Medicare eligible patient stayed in the hospital for 3 days, they would report that they stayed in the hospital for like 5 days just to try and get that percentage bumped up. And this is also kind of what brought them down towards the end, but we'll get to that here in a little bit.
So now I'll be covering upcoding. I know the previous group also covered upcoding, so you guys are already a little familiar, but I thought it was important to still cover that because it is a significant part of this fraud. So I'll be covering diagnosis-related groups. So diagnosis-related groups are the code system that Medicare specifically uses for paying out patients. So say, for example, you come in with a sprained ankle, that would pay an amount, let's say $100. If you came in with a broken ankle, that would pay a little bit more, like 120. So how upcoding worked is the doctors would exaggerate the diagnoses. So a pretty common one with HCA that I saw a lot of documentation on was pneumonia. People would come in with more mild cases of pneumonia, but the doctors would report it to Medicare that it was a more severe case and entitled them to that larger payout. Another way that this worked is sometimes doctors would submit ambiguous documentation so that the person actually reporting this to Medicare couldn't really tell what was the severity of the case. So instead, what they would do is HCA would try and use the most extreme version that they could justify using the ambiguous documentation rather than using a average metric or taking a more conservative approach.
And lab test billing is another one of their fraudulent activities. So unrecorded lab tests. So these were tests that were never performed or never approved by the physician. And this adds additional tests without any medical justification or signed approval. And it causes Medicare and private insurers to end up paying more for tests that weren't necessary. And it was actually discovered in some of the audits that the patient records failed to show the intent to order for a lot of the tests. And then double billing is exactly what it sounds like. So they would charge for a comprehensive panel of tests and then additional individual tests that were already included within the panel, which increased again Medicare and private insurers, causing them to pay more. And then lastly, custom profiles. So this is a custom collection of tests. So instead of doing a comprehensive panel, you can pick and choose which tests were going to be ordered. And a lot of the times the physicians didn't even know that there were hidden extra costs within it. So these were tests that were hidden within the system that physicians were unaware of were additions to the custom profiles. And this led to a massive volume of unnecessary claims across the network.
And then the final fraud scheme that we're going to talk about is the physician kickback scheme, which seems like everybody's very familiar with. But one thing to note with these ones is that it's not just a few side deals or just a few rogue actors. This was a systematic way that HCA approached doing business, and it all centered around the core idea of keeping these physician referrals staying inside of the HCA hospital network. And so what they did was they used consulting contracts, compensation arrangements, and other financial perks to essentially make it so the physicians got their kickback, and these arrangements had no real business purpose, but they seemed legitimate from people on the outside looking in, and they were paid for services that were unnecessary, inflated, or not even performed at all sometimes. So some of these below market perks that they would offer would be like equipment or staffing, or I think office space is another one. And then the way that this was found was a few whistleblowers within the organization noticed that these physicians were being paid for doing essentially nothing. And so that kind of is what brought it to life.
All right, and now we're going to look at the consequences and the takeaways of the fraud scheme. So like we mentioned early, James Alderson was the CFO of one of the hospitals that was managed by the HCA subsidiary. And he was actually aware of the two sets of books and knew that this was a very questionable accounting practice. When he began to question this within the organization, he was subsequently fired, to which he then filed a lawsuit in 1993 under the False Claims Act's qui tam provision, which essentially allows an individual to file a lawsuit on behalf of the government, to which the government can then review and decide if they want to join in on this lawsuit. And in this case, they did. It was also filed under seal, which means the government was able to begin investigation and HCA was not yet made aware of this. And then eventually more whistleblowers did come forward. I believe there were roughly 30 in total by the end of this. But our consequences, obviously, like I said, the DOJ wants an investigation. This created what was at the time one of the largest fraud scheme settlements in U.S. healthcare history, which I believe has now been surpassed multiple times. But so HCA subsidiaries pled guilty to 14 different felonies. And this was actually part of the plea deal because as a healthcare corporation, if you plead guilty to certain felonies, or if you are guilty of certain felonies, you're actually no longer eligible to receive Medicare. So if the HCA parent company would have pleaded guilty, then that means like one of the largest hospital companies in the country would have lost access to Medicare funding, which would have caused probably absolute chaos. But the total settlement was about $1.7 billion, with 840 million of this coming in the first round of charges in 2000, which covered their criminal charges as well as billing fraud. And then 3 years later in 2003, there was another $881 million settlement, which covered the remaining cost report and any kickback claims. The executives were actually let off free. The company themselves actually absorbed all of the charges. As a matter of fact, the CEO, Rick Scott, who resigned as a result of this fraud, actually went on to become governor of Florida and is now a U.S. senator. So quite the career trajectory for him. But this also accelerated healthcare compliance changes. So HCA was also required to enter into a corporate integrity agreement, which I don't know how it works in practice, but I think is supposed to at least be kind of like a corporate probation where they're held to stricter cost report standards and overall just have like much tighter supervision. And also industry changes. There was an industry-wide internal compliance program built out. So I kind of like to think of it as like the healthcare version of COSO, where there was like a guideline issued for best practices for compliance.
And then we had some pretty clear takeaways from this HCA fraud. And scale, the first one is that scale doesn't protect you. It actually amplifies the risk. And this is shown by the snowball effect that all of these frauds that we have talked about collectively led to a $1.7 billion settlement. And then the next one is that fraud doesn't exist in isolation. And oftentimes the tone at the top is very essential for these firms to not only have the lower level employees knowing exactly what they're doing or being able to find fraud, but it kind of shows you like there was, I think, what did he say, 14 felony charges against the subsidiaries. So that just kind of shows. And then the next one is that whistleblowers are essential. So kind of like I said, the physicians kickback scheme was actually brought to light through whistleblowers and oh yeah, the government's ability to actually collect the money from this was helped through these whistleblowers. And then the last one is that fraud isn't victimless. this took away valuable resources from people that actually needed healthcare at the time, and every improper claim just essentially drained the resources from those people that needed the actual healthcare. And then why this still matters. So the top one is definitely the most important, at least to our lives right now, as we are young business professionals. It just kind of shows you how maybe normal business practices can drift into that fraud. Things that you might think are going on at your company that are normal could potentially not be normal, and you just need to practice that professional judgment. And it just shows the importance of monitoring physician relationships and referral patterns. So kind of like auditor relationships, we're supposed to be independent. Physicians probably should be too, and reinforces the need for strong internal controls and compliance culture. Kind of like I said, those 14 subsidiaries that had the federal charges against them, kind of just amplifies that, and then highlights the government's willingness to pursue long and complex investigations. So this took, I think it was 10 years over the course. So just kind of shows that. And then it also serves as a cautionary example for healthcare organizations today on how they can be a little more ethical. And then, thank you. Any questions?
So what do the whistleblowers get out of it?
So under the False Claims Act, I think they're entitled to receive like 15 to 30% of the settlement, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know about individual whistleblowers, but in total, I think they got like 150 million out of it. Yeah.
Yeah. That whistleblower provision, that QTAM Act, that drives all sorts of investigations in healthcare, and they can get that much. And I've met them, and often they start out as people who say, "Hey, we shouldn't be doing X," and the organization says basically, "Stay in your lane." Or they're terminated. If they're terminated, then they also can go after the organization for retaliation and can make even more money in that. You all did a great job of breaking down the various laws that they broke, or allegedly broke. And it did change healthcare. Like that big corporate integrity agreement that they got, if you get a corporate integrity agreement, you have to hire what's called an independent review organization, which is what Michael helped me on when I was at KPMG. The IRO has to be an independent entity that basically audits and makes sure that the company's complying with that corporate integrity agreement. They could be pretty lucrative engagements because CIA typically lasts 5 years. And as a consultant, knowing that you just won a 5-year engagement is about as good as it comes regarding revenue generation. So an IRO was hired, and basically HCA had to show that they were complying with the requirements, and they were able, it seems like, to turn their culture around after Rick Scott was gone.
Davida.
Huh? All right. Here, yeah, you can take that aside. Okay. So we did our fraud research case over DaVita. I'm Brett.
I'm Tyler.
I'm Hannah.
I'm Jake. I'm Andrew.
So first I'm going to talk about the industry and what exactly DaVita does. So DaVita is an American healthcare company headquartered in Denver, Colorado. They are one of the industry leaders in kidney care and dialysis services. The care they provide mostly focuses on end-stage renal disease, or EDSR. This is a condition where patients require dialysis about 3 times a week unless they are able to receive a transplant. DaVita currently operates in over 2,000 U.S. medical centers and over 500 international medical centers in 14 different countries. Last year, they served over 200,000 patients and had about 13.6 billion in annual revenue. They have about a 37% market share, and their main competitor is Fresenius, which the two together make up about 80% of the market. So the main services DaVita provides are the dialysis and their integrated kidney care, or IKC. The dialysis service is their core revenue engine. It's their traditional business operations in their clinics where they bill patients for the services they receive. And then the IKC is where DaVita takes on patients for a total cost, and then they kind of receive bonuses and stuff for keeping patients healthy and away from the hospital. Together, these two generated about 13 of the 13.6 billion they had in revenue. IKC also operates under the name Village Health, and both support patients from early stages of EDSR all the way up to transplants. But whenever we look at the payer mix, we see for the dialysis services, of the 13 billion in revenue, about 68 comes from government funded programs, and 32% comes from like private insurance companies. The other 600 million of their revenue comes from their lab services, pharmaceutical management, and nutritional guidance. And a quick history of DaVita: they were founded in 1979 as Medical Ambulatory Care Incorporated. In 1994, they were acquired by DJL Merchant Banking and renamed to Total Rental Care. They went public in 1995, but they were nearly bankrupt in 1999. A new CEO, Kent Thiry, comes in to help bring them back and get them moving again. They were renamed to DaVita in 2000, which stood for to give life. They went through several different acquisitions between 2005 and 2016, helping them grow quite a bit. But then they fell into a lot of legal trouble with their frauds. So they had, in 2012, a double billing fraud scheme for 55 million. In 2014, a kickback scheme for 350 million. In 2015, a false claim and whistleblower scheme for 495 million. In 2017, a 63.7 false billing fraud, and then another kickback scheme in 2024 for 34 million. Javier Rodriguez became the new CEO in 2019, and they sold a lot of their operations to Optum, and Kent Thiry in 2021 was charged for market collusion. So yeah, that's a little background of DaVita.
So the first frauds that we wanted to talk about were the double billing and the false billing frauds. So a brief rundown of how they committed double billing. So DaVita uses a drug called Epigen a lot. It's used for treating anemia, and it helps with red blood cell count in dialysis patients. And so what DaVita would do was they would use oversized vials, and they would bill for the full amount of the vial used, even if they didn't use the full vial. If there were leftovers, they would keep that. And then on top of that, they would reuse the used vials, the leftovers for new patients. There's a term called used medical necessity. Basically, what that means is hospitals and medical facilities are required to give slightly more than the exact amount of a dosage needed so that a patient can administer themselves the amount that they need for each dose for the entire period which they have a prescription or have need for a drug. And so they would use these vials that had more than that and would give either the exact amount or they would leave leftovers in, and then they would reuse it, bill for the first use of it, and then bill for the second use of the same vial. And that caused a lot of lots of other issues, health related. In mid 2000s, Ivy Woodward came forward and pointed out that there was a pattern of billing drugs repeatedly, and that vials were allegedly being used for new patients or reused. And she sued the company under the False Claims Act. And the final settlement came out to about 55 million that DaVita was required to pay out in 2012. And then the next major one is the false billing. So what happened here was DaVita owned a pharmaceutical company, subsidiary, DaVita RX. And they would use that subsidiary to fraudulently bill federal healthcare programs for various line items, such as medications that were returned or medications that were never shipped. They accepted discount cards from manufacturers instead of the co-payments, which was the procedure. They also wrote off unpaid patient balances, which you are not supposed to do. And in 2007, Patsy Gillian and Monique Jones noticed that there were patterns of improper billing, and they came forward and blew the whistle, and the final settlement agreement was for 63.7 million in this case in 2017. And 3.2 million was allocated to state Medicare claims that elected to participate in this process.
So in 2015, DaVita reached their largest settlement of 495 million for a fraud that occurred from 2003 to 2012. This fraud was brought forward by two whistleblowers. The first was Dr. Alan J. Veneer. He specialized in kidney diseases and was a medical director for several DaVita clinics in Georgia. The other whistleblower was nurse Daniel D. Barbier. He was a registered nurse and he worked as a clinic director in a clinic in Georgia. So they brought these claims under the False Claim Act, which was founded in 1863 during the Civil War, and it is used to prosecute illegal billings or false billings against the government. It has expanded a lot over the years, and one of these main expansions is the Tam Act or section of it, and it allows for individuals such as the whistleblowers in this case to file on behalf of the government. And this is how most false claim acts are done. So these people who file on behalf of the government are called realtors, and they can get up to 15 and 30% of the damages for themselves as recovery. So this case is a landmark case in the entirety of the False Claims Act because it is the largest settlement in which the government has not actively participated. Usually what happens with the Tam Act is they file it and then the government comes and they look at the case and they can decide to participate in it and not. If the government chooses not to participate, the odds of winning dramatically drop. So the fact that they won at this amount is kind of historic. So the fraud in this case, they claimed that DaVita was illegally billing Medicare and Medicaid for medication that they claimed they used, but they actually threw away parts of it. During this case, another section of it was the CDC, Central for Disease Control, updated their protocols for administering medications, and these whistleblowers claimed that DaVita actively ignored these and failed to follow them. So the main medicines in the fraud were Zemplar, which is a form of vitamin D, and Venofer, an iron supplement. These are used for to manage complications of patients with chronic kidney disease who are undergoing the process of dialysis. How it worked in the same way, but different processes. So for Zemplar, it comes in small vials of like 2 to 8 to 4 grams to 10 grams. And so if somebody needed 8 grams of medication, they would use 10 grams instead of 2 or 4 grams. So they would overdo it, but it was a relatively smaller amount. But for Venofer, they really only come in 100 milligrams. So they would give them 25 milligrams and then just throw away the 75 other ones. So there was a lot more waste going on in this.
I'm gonna be talking about two major kickback schemes then that DaVita was a part of. The first one has to do with doctors that had many kidney patients they would target. They would need like dialysis and certain things. And they would offer these doctors an ownership stake in a DaVita clinic for like much lower than fair market value. So they thought they were being pretty sneaky, but they ended up getting caught there. And how this would work was they would make those doctors refer like anyone that needed kidney care to a DaVita clinic. They wouldn't let them refer them anywhere else. It was unethical, obviously. And it was caught by just an internal whistleblower. The auditors never caught this. And it was investigated under the False Claims Act. And the second kickback fraud happened about 10 years later, where this one happened where they subsidized like overhead costs and they would pay for fees to find new doctors, like administrative fees. So it was a little bit different, but they expected the same benefit. They would make these new doctors and make these private clinics refer like all their patients needing kidney care to DaVita clinics again, which they were not allowed to do. And it was also flagged by whistleblowers and was under the False Claims Act enforcement.
Do you know why they're not allowed to do that?
I believe
The anti-kickback statute.
the anti-kickback statute.
Like Stark Law, kind of like Group 2 talked about.
Yeah. Okay.
And then these are kind of the results of both those. They were both actually settled. First one was for $350 million. And they made DaVita dissolve 11 of these partnerships they created illegally with the doctors. And they actually were forced under like a federal oversight for 5 years afterwards. And the second result, the second fraud, about 10 years later, it's another settlement for 34 million, another false claim settlement. They wanted to settle so they could keep billing Medicare. And these just kind of further exposed that their internal audit control failures. And nowadays they're trying to improve their internal controls, I know, since they had so many fraud schemes. And this one, there's actually a pretty big payout to the whistleblower to help kind of incentivize whistleblowers in the future to come forward and to report if they see any wrongdoing.
So our personal recommendations for compliance improvements, we're going to start with strengthening internal compliance programs, kind of like the first group talked about, having some real-time billing software that would flag these potential errors, making it more well-known to people within the company what was occurring, so duplicate charges, unbilled returns, things like that. Also having regular internal audits across clinics and compliance officers at the regional level. So not only people at the top who are in charge of compliance, but people seeing the day-to-day operations that are also involved with the compliance process. Second, we would implement stricter whistleblower protections and culture improvements, like Dr. Barnes has talked about in class. It is very common for fraud cases to happen because of internal cooperation and whistleblowers. So it's very rare for external auditors to find fraud specifically. It usually comes from somebody blowing the whistle. And many of these cases could have been uncovered earlier if, like, obviously the one that Hannah mentioned occurred over a decade, I believe. And many of these could have been uncovered earlier if the employees had not potentially felt scared to come out and blow the whistle. That goes hand in hand with improving the tone at the top. If you have executives in place that show they care about compliance, then your employees will not be scared to care about compliance as well. Next, we would have more physician relationship transparency. So if you are a physician and you have a relationship with the company, a business relationship, that needs to be fully disclosed. And there needs to be independent legal reviews of any of these physician deals that you make. If you have stake in a clinic or some sort of other operating function of the hospital,
and then prohibit these non-compete and disparagement agreements that were being used to encourage these physicians to kind of incentivize the kickbacks. Then finally, some independent compliance oversight. I'm sure they have this now, would establish a compliance committee that reports directly to the Board of Governors, potentially even tying compensation practices of key employees to like some compliance metrics, saying like, it's very simple, but if you don't get in trouble, you will have more incentivized payment. And then obviously just doing a proactive approach versus a reactive approach, making sure that you were trying to prevent the fraud from happening in the first place versus just reacting to it once it does happen. So for DaVita, the future outlook and industry concerns. So there is a growing end-stage renal disease population due to American health habits, and diabetes and hypertension are only increasing. And then their integrated kidney care, I know that Brett talked about that a little bit, is probably a model that they're looking to expand for future reimbursement reform. Since they have expanded into these 14 countries, there are various revenue streams that they could potentially, that are untapped in these 14 countries, as well as home dialysis is growing. So it's cheaper and the patient prefers home dialysis because they don't have to obviously leave their home to receive treatment. So hopefully they can expand into that market as well. For some industry concerns and risks, like Brett mentioned, a lot of their revenue mix is based on government reimbursement, and Medicare and Medicaid rate cuts could potentially squeeze their margins. So this could be a pressure to lead to potentially more fraud if they have certain revenue margins and goals that they're looking to hit, as well as they are now kind of with these 5 fraud cases that we discussed, they are always going to be kind of under the watch of the Department of Justice, given their history, which kind of valid in my opinion, I would say. And then they have staffing shortages in specialized renal nursing and technical areas. So the people that actually do provide the care, there's a shortage in that type of specialized care as well. And finally, with kidney transplant improvements, that could potentially lessen the need for dialysis 3 times a week. So if you are able to have better kidney transplants, then obviously people won't need dialysis as much. So thank you. Any questions?
Did you all, by any chance, come across the John Oliver piece about dialysis when you were researching this?
We did not.
I know I love John Oliver though.
When you get a chance, Google John Oliver dialysis, and he talks about DaVita and Fresenius. 80% of the discussion is about DaVita and its culture and all of the things that they did allegedly wrong. And it is fascinating. And the other reason why I want all of you all to look at that is the deep dive that his team does to understand the industry and understand the mechanisms that could lead to overbilling or fraud. I would say to all of you all, great job. When you do what it is that you all are going to do, if you get jobs at consulting firms or in some sort of a accounting or fraud background, you'll need to be subject matter superstars. And that's very hard. Like I asked that one team, so what law did they break? You need to be able to, you're not going to law school, a lot of you, but you need to be able to understand the laws that are allegedly being broken, what the requirements of those laws are, and where an organization supposedly breached those requirements. And then you need to understand the various underlying revenue implications. So one of the gentlemen did a great job, or one of the folks did a great job talking about upcoding and DRGs. I worked with, like when I worked on DaVita, I was DaVita's IRO, independent review organization. And I worked hand in hand with external audit folks from KPMG who were DaVita's external audit. They knew medical coding and billing almost to the extent that medical coders knew coding. So you'll have to get a very strong subject matter expertise in the area that you're being asked to investigate. You can't just have general understanding of it. And then I guess the last thing I would say is this last group did a really good job of providing some recommendations. Um, Essentially, when you do these kind of investigations, you get paid to do the investigations, but you can also get paid to implement solutions or fixes. Your bosses are going to want to know from you, okay, you investigated, you did all of this, you did all the research. Now what? What should we do after this? You should be able to, with strategic thinking, say, here's what I would do to fix the problem and bring that to the table. And then the last thing is, guess what? Here's a shocker. All of the organizations that you all discussed today were for-profit healthcare entities, and in all of them, leadership at the highest levels, except for Forest Park Medical Center, were allowed to continue on with the organization.
Have a round of applause for our good guest here.
Thanks. Do you guys have any questions about any of those cases or
All
any?
right, guys, see you on Thursday. Ken, thank you so much, sir.
Welcome. You want to take 2 minutes to debrief, or you just want to call me later if you need anything?